Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to Engage ICT. My name's Sarah Jane Crespo. I'm Engagement Marketing Director at KMUW. I'm really happy to see all of you here tonight. We're so excited by this turnout. We're so excited that so many people are interested to learn about policy and about legislation and what's happening and how it all affects you. So thank you very much for coming out. To start off, I'd like to thank our sponsors this evening, starting with the Monarch. Thank you so much for this wonderful space. I'd also like to thank Open Wichita for helping us with our survey and the information for our engageict.org website, and Digital Brand for helping us to record these events so that anyone who maybe misses one of them can catch up on whatever that topic was at a later date. And I'd like to thank the Wichita Community Foundation and the Knight Foundation for helping to make this event series possible. Lastly, I'd also like to thank the Wichita Public Library for partnering with us to bring you additional information. Okay, and we will kick it off here, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. They'll give you an overview of their perspective, and then we'll get into a little bit of discussion. So to start off, we will have John Allison. Okay, John Allison has served as superintendent in the Wichita Public Schools since 2009. During that time, the district has led the implementation of systemic reforms focusing on student literacy. Allison is a member of the Wichita Metro Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and helped develop the Business Education Innovation Partnership between the district and the chamber. He's also on the United Way of the Plains Board of Directors. In 2012, Allison was named a finalist for the Richard R. Green Award, the nation's top prize for urban school education leadership. Prior to becoming superintendent for Wichita Public Schools, Allison served 2 years as superintendent of Mount Lebanon School District in Pennsylvania and was associate superintendent for education services for the Shawnee Mission District. Allison earned his bachelor's from KU, his master's from Emporia State, and his doctorate in education leadership at St. Louis University. Let's have an overview from John Allison.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to see such a crowd here tonight as we talk about education. And it's absolutely critical that as a community we engage around the topic of education, because it is really the linchpin and the foundation of where we will go as a city, as a state, and is a prime factor in the economic development that we hope to see in the future. Just a few things that I find a lot of folks don't understand the structures around the public school system. We have 7 elected board members. They are volunteers. There's absolutely no compensation that they receive for all the hours they put in. In Wichita, there are 6 that are elected by a specific district or area, and then there is an at-large board member. In the primaries, they run by district. In the general election, they run citywide. So that's a little unique for many school districts where they'll do one or the other. And we kind of have a hybrid for that aspect. These individuals spend huge amounts of time. The districts they represent, if you think in terms of state representatives, are larger and encompass a larger populace. So when they're elected, they have quite a wide area that they're representing. Our board works very hard, even though they are elected by districts. They are representing the students and the community in their entirety in Wichita. So it's not about my district versus someone else's. It's really about what's in the best interest of our students. At the state level, there is, by our Constitution, there is a State Board of Education that functions in a similar fashion. The local school board's primary responsibilities are around establishing policy and budget. I am their single employee. So the hiring, firing, those types of things are a function that the administration takes care of. The Board of Education is at that higher level when we think about the policy and the budget issues. At the state level, the state board helps establish the standards and some of those other aspects. The key reason that I'm so glad that we're engaging in community-wide conversation around education, as I said, is because of its importance. And education today cannot look like it did when you and I went to school. And let me give you just a little information around that. In 1940, 28% of the population had a high school diploma. In 1960, 48%. 1970, 59%. In 1980, 73%. And in 2005, 89%. And the types of jobs that folks get today and need, the level of education or training that they need to be able to support a family, won't work on a 1940s education or a 1950s or 1970. The bar has continued to be elevated on what we expect students to know, how we expect them to apply that knowledge, and we're preparing students for a future and future jobs that don't even exist today. So we really need to be developing lifelong learners. Our focus in Wichita over the last several years has been around systemic reform and a focus on literacy, particularly early literacy. And knowing that about 77% of our students come from homes of poverty, that creates an additional challenge as we try to prepare students moving forward. And to give you another example, when you look at a student that is coming from a home of poverty, if we do not have those students ready and proficient to read by third grade, they only have about a 30% chance of being proficient by the time they graduate high school. And if you think then that not being proficient as they progress, that means that they're 4 times less likely to graduate from high school, which is the bare minimum education that we need to have our students prepared as they look to the future. And when you add poverty to that equation, they're 13 times less likely to graduate from high school. So poverty makes a difference in the challenges we have when the students come in the door. And we accept all that come in, and we need to be able to meet them where they are and elevate them as they move forward. And the last little bit, not to kill you with data, but when you think about the gap that a student has when they enter kindergarten, if they're coming from a professional home, both educated parents, by the time they enter kindergarten, they've been exposed, both written and orally, to about 45 million words. If they're coming from a working class family, that's about 26 million. And if they're coming from a home of poverty, that's about 13 million. So you can see the gap between students starting life in poverty compared to their middle class peers. They start with a big hill to climb. So that's why we have focused so heavily on that early literacy piece, because we know that's the foundational aspect that they're going to need moving forward. Again, I look forward to our conversation tonight and appreciate all of your support.
Okay, next up we have Jim Freeman. He is the Chief Financial Officer for Wichita Public Schools. He holds a Master of Science in Education, School Business Management from Northern Illinois University, a Master of Music, a Bachelor of Music Education, and a Bachelor of Music Performance from Wichita State University. Jim's career in education began as an instrumental music teacher, which evolved into a technology coordinator, then business manager, and then to his current position as CFO. Jim is active in the Kansas Association School Business Officials, where he has served as president, and in United School Administrators, serving as co-chair of its School Finance Committee and previously on its Legislative Committee. Jim is a frequent expert resource on school finance matters in Kansas. While working in Kansas and Illinois, Jim and his wife Deanne raised 2 sons, David and Daniel. Let's hear an overview from Jim.
Thank you, and also thank you for coming out and being interested and being engaged. We struggle a lot sometimes to be able to talk about the things that are important to us, and I'm going to focus. I have a sign in my office that says "Kids are my business." So I'm really on the education side of things, but I'm the numbers guy. So you're going to get a lot of numbers from me and some background on how school finance works and that sort of thing. But education, school districts in the state of Kansas, all across the state, it's a people business. We educate students using staff, and about 80% of our budgets are all in people. So our human resources is what drives what we're able to accomplish. In Wichita, we employ over 9,000 people, and we educate 51,130 kids. So it's a big task, and we've got a lot of numbers that we work with and a lot of things that we deal with. We're in 100 buildings across the city. And one of the things that is interesting, Wichita Public Schools is probably, well, it's unique in the state of Kansas. We really don't have any peers from a standpoint of how big we are. But we do exactly the same thing that the school district in Leoti, Kansas does. We educate kids. And in Wichita, 88% of our operating budget is used and spent directly in supporting students in education. So the information you hear a lot of times about how we're not getting money into the classroom, that really isn't true. It depends on what data you look at that determines that. But we do everything we can to put money into the classroom to educate the students that we have. Statewide, the budget for K-12 education that comes from the state general fund is about $4 billion. It's about half of the state general budget. So it is an important thing at the legislative level. And in the state, there's about 460,000 students. And Wichita's operating budget is about $436 million. So you look at all those numbers, Wichita is about 10% of the state. So we're about 10% of the K-12 education budget and about 10% of the students. So when you hear things at the legislative level about education budgets and that sort of thing, when you think about that, what we do here represents 10% of the work that's done. Our funding comes from basically three sources. State, which comes from the state general fund, represents about 69.5% of our budget. And that's general state aid, and the general state aid that comes to us is actually made up of property tax, income tax, and sales tax. But 69% of our budget comes from the state, 17.7% comes from local. And on the local side, it's property tax across a variety of funds, and student fees, and some local grants that we have. The third piece of it is federal funds. We get about 12% of our operating funds from the federal government. This is mostly in title funding, but also in special education and in our nutrition service, our food service department. The funding is mostly controlled by the legislature. Our legislature establishes and controls the state funding for us and 67% of our actual local funding through the regulations that we deal with. So most of the control of the finances that comes to us is at the legislative level. The school board sets the budget based on the regulations and the state statutes that that comes down from Topeka. And so they approve the budget based on what comes from the legislature, and they actually set a couple of the mill levies that are there based on what the needs are in capital outlay and the bond and interest fund. K-12 education is highly regulated, and a lot of people don't understand how this works, but we operate under all of the same state and federal laws that any business does. Plus, if we have federal money, we have lots of federal guidelines, and if any of you have dealt with the federal government on any kind of regulation, you know that can get kind of ugly. We have a lot of federal guidelines that we have to follow, and of course the state legislature has a lot of statutes that we deal with. There's also state regulations you don't hear a lot about, but we have to follow all the regulations. And then, of course, the state school board also has their policies and regulations. And then finally, our local school board passes policy that we are governed with. So almost everything that we do is governed by some regulation, some law that's out there. So we try and meet all of those standards as we're developing our budgets. Our current challenges in funding. You've probably heard a lot about the block grant. Last year in March, they threw away the old school finance formula and improved a block grant. The basic difference between the two funding formulas is that the old formula was based on our enrollment times a base state aid or an amount, so it was based on the number of kids that we have. The block grant, however, is a flat funding model. They determine the amount of money that we receive, and it doesn't change. They based that on the 14-15 budget that we had approved. So whatever we spend in 14-15 is what we have for this year and what we have for next year. So we don't have any way to adjust for enrollment increases. We don't have a way to adjust for fixed cost increases like utilities and that sort of thing. So you've probably heard me talk or seen information at the school board about how we're going to reduce some budgets next year because the funding is so flat. So a big challenge for us to have to develop that when you look at what our other cost increases are. And one of the things that we get to deal with also, and we don't have any control over this really to speak of, is the federal funding. The school district gets about $25 to $30 million in federal funding, and we are at the mercy of the federal government, and they had just went through a recent reauthorization, and we're still uncertain about what our federal funding level is going to be there. So basically speaking, my job is to try and build a budget that marshals the resources that we do have to continue to educate the 51,000 kids. And so it becomes very important that our public is understanding of how we spend our money and what our particular needs are, because it's basically controlled at the legislative level. So I look forward to discussions to come later.
Okay, next on the panel we have Dave Kirkbride. He is in his 37th year as Executive Director of South Central Kansas National Education Association, which is the teachers association for the suburban Wichita area. He earned his bachelor's in English from Northwestern Oklahoma State and a master's in secondary ed from WSU. Prior to assuming his current position, he taught high school language arts at several area high schools, including Clearwater High and Wichita East High. Dave served as faculty advisor for the East High student newspaper and was chairperson of the Clearwater High School Language Arts Department. He founded the journalism program at Clearwater High, as well as the school newspaper and the high school literary magazine. During his years as a teacher, he was also a member of the Kansas NEA Board of Directors. He's an officer with the Kansas Sierra Club, a husband, father of 2 grown children, and a grandfather of 6. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to see such a good turnout for on the subject of education. I think that's a subject that the residents of Kansas need to be focused on at this particular time. One subject I've been asked to comment on is the Common Core state standards. This is something that has been used as a political football, and there's a lot of misinformation about Common Core state standards, and it's been used to, I've heard people allege that this was a plot by the federal government or a plot by the Obama administration, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the idea and the beginnings of Common Core state standards happened before President Obama was even elected. The idea came from a paper that was drafted by Janet Napolitano, the former governor of Arizona, who was also the chair of the National Governors Conference. And as all people in that position, she wrote a paper to kind of set the direction for the governors, the National Governors Association. And she had a big concern about the fact that we have a very mobile society, and we have people who move from one state to another constantly. And she was concerned that if we're going to compete internationally, we have to have some coordination from state to state if we're going to have a strong educational system. And so that was the genesis of the Common Core state standards. But here in Kansas, it also has been, that subject has also been used as a political football. And in fact, just this week, the Kansas Department of Education started the process of adopting a new term. The new term is Kansas Curricular Standards. The standards are going to remain the same, but they're changing the name to try to blunt some of the political antagonism toward the Common Core. When I first heard about the Common Core state standards, I thought it was a very good idea, and I still think it's a good idea. In a society like ours, I think having some, and a lot of people have said that this is a plot to tell teachers how to teach each subject, and that is not the case. It's simply an idea to try to make sure that all students receive a basic fundamental education. There are some other topics I want to address as well, and one of those is the education, the political climate toward education in this state right now. I'm very concerned about public education. I think public education is the backbone of a democratic society, and I believe that our current governor and his supporters in the legislature are trying to diminish public education in Kansas and perhaps destroy it. And I think that's one reason I'm very happy to see all of you here tonight, is because we need to do something about this in the next election. It's not going to change unless we get very politically active. And one of our problems, one reason we're in this situation in Kansas, is because of the low voter turnout. And we're going to have to encourage our neighbors, our relatives, to come to the polls next fall and elect pro-public education candidates. If we don't, we're going to see public education diminished or disappear in this state. And there are continued attempts to privatize education in Kansas. And just yesterday, there was a bill that passed out of the House Education Committee that would increase the amount of tax break that corporations can have for giving scholarships to use scholarships for students to attend private schools. This is siphoning money off of out of public education into private schools. And I have no problem with private schools, but I think we don't want to destroy public education. And I think the current attitude in Topeka among a lot of the folks there is to do just that. And I look forward to other comments and questions here this evening.
Okay, our final panelist this evening is Sheelu Surender. She is the Director of Financial Aid at Wichita State University, where she leads an operation that administered over $102 million in financial aid awards last year. She has been in the Office of Financial Aid in multiple roles for 17 years, having begun at Wichita State as a loan counselor. She is a member of several financial aid organizations, including the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Her leadership on the Wichita State campus involves contribution in strategic enrollment management, and she also serves as an advisor to the WSU Student Ambassador Society. She's active in the Wichita community, having volunteered for Junior Achievement, Kansas Food Bank, YMCA, and First Mennonite Brethren Church. She was also part of the 2011 class of Leadership Wichita. She's a first-generation college graduate who earned a BA in International Business and Business Administration from Friends University and an MBA from Wichita State University. So to give us a little bit of information about the college perspective, Sheelu Surender.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. It's my pleasure to be here with you today, and I appreciate that all of you came out. It is an important part of the education system, college education, and just higher education in general, post-secondary education. So the more that we can, as a office and staff members, educate the public about financial aid and the components of financial aid, it's impacts all policy decisions, issues, and it's important to us both as consumers and also as taxpayers. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with financial aid, I want to give you a brief overview. Since the enactment of the Higher Education Act in 1965, so over 50 years ago, federal financial aid has been a critical pathway for college access. So that's one of the components, really, of a way for access to low-income students. The application for Title IV aid, really, and the programs is the free application for federal financial aid. And that's the FAFSA, which it collects demographic information from students, income, asset information, and really is the component that looks at what can a student and their family contribute towards educational costs. The Department of Education uses this information to confirm students' general eligibility to receive Title IV funding, and it calculates an index that's called the estimated family contribution. So looking at what can that family contribute towards higher education costs. And our office really uses that EFC information, so that family contribution number, looks at what need is based on that number compared to cost of education, general cost of education, and average, and looks at how we can award the students. And so when we're looking at that, there's a greater and greater need for federal financial aid for our students, we're finding. And this aid not only consists of grants, but also work study, so that's a part-time work employment program, as well as student loans. In recent numbers, the applications for federal financial aid, just within a 5-year period, so from 2008 to 2012, it increased the applications by 62%. So a huge jump in applications just within such a short period of time. And that could have been a result of just education in general to students and families and letting them know about the process. Could have been a result of the recession and families not being able to afford college education and the high costs of college education. So there's a lot of different factors in that. The average, the majority of students who receive Pell Grants, whether it's a dependent student or independent student, their family income typically ranges under $40,000 for dependent students, and for independent students, it's under $20,000. So very low incomes for the majority of students. And although Pell Grants provide a substantial assistance to millions of students, nearly 8.9 million students received it in my 2012-2013 data. It's the student loans that often garner the attention. And we in the financial aid community feel that a modest amount of borrowing is sometimes required. And part of that could be based on students not having the ability to pay because they've saved less for college, the family's not having the abilities, and so they're having to take out more student loans. So for us, really, all of this reliance on student loans, we're trying to get ahead of that and really educate our students. We're trying to go out and do more outreach to students at the high school level, at the middle school level, just encouraging them, first of all, that college is an option for them, and then second of all, how to finance that without a lot of debt. Our students at Wichita State, typically the graduating average loan debt is around $21,000. Nationally, the average is more in the $26,000 to $30,000 range. So we're below the national average, but it is, for us, it's trying to educate the students about reducing that borrowing, and is there ways that they can, perhaps have a summer job and perhaps save the dollars that they're earning as a student, because both that student income and the family's income is considered in that cost of education. Some of the legislation that's been on the horizon for us, really, we look at it in terms of what the next year budget holds. Nearly, I would guess, around 80% of our funding comes from federal financial dollars. Each year, there's less and less of state dollars in resources. That's a huge impact when we're talking about students and every dollar counting, especially in grant funds. And so for us, that means, okay, how are we able to take those Pell Grants and other things? We often think, okay, that's going to be reduced because of these budget constraints and the tight budget times that we are in. But over the past several years, there's been a modest increase in the Pell Grant. And even for the upcoming next year, there is a slight increase. So we're very relieved about that. But those Pell Grants for our very, very needy families, it's not even enough to cover tuition and fees. And so, okay, what are the next resources that students have access to? And there are other grant funds besides the Pell Grant. And so oftentimes we look at that in terms of very needy students and what we can offer in scholarships and institutional dollars, as well as most of that at Wichita State. There's a balance between foundation funds and institutional dollars, and so we have to award students based on both merit and need. And so since we have Pell Grants and other grant funds, we try to build a package that, again, reduces the loan debts. There are loan limits based on a student's grade level in college, so that funding also can only go so far, and especially for students who are dependent. Some of the things that are coming up because of the reauthorization of Higher Education Act is really looking at a simplified FAFSA. So typically the FAFSA, the application, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to complete right now, but a lot of families feel like that's even very difficult to complete. But right now, the application itself is very intuitive. There's skip logic built in. There's infographics so that students, when they're answering those questions, they can really understand what the question is asking. There's a data retrieval tool that really can pull in information from the tax returns, both the parents and the students. So lots of ways to help students complete that, because really, until a student completes that, we cannot build a budget for them that shows what they would qualify for. That's the first step. So simplifying that even further is one of the agendas. Another is really consumer information. More and more, as a financial aid office, we're being tasked with providing that consumer information, and there's requirements all across campus, not just in terms of what financial aid offers and the total package, but also what the rest of the campus offers in terms of graduation rates, in terms of even safety and security. Lots of it is, all of these other avenues are tied to financial aid because that's the funding source. So we have to ensure that every piece of information that is really required by the federal government, more and more is being required when we access these dollars, then we have to be able to put that information out there for consumers so that you can make an informed decision about the colleges that you select. Another thing that we kind of dodged a bullet on is the Perkins loan. It's a very low interest loan for need-based students, and we thought that that was going to end at the end of last year, but they've granted a 2-year extension on that, which is huge for Wichita State because that's $2 million in resources that we would have lost out on and our students would have lost out on. It's a loan program, but because of the low interest and nature of it, it fills the gap oftentimes for how a student can afford college and those costs. So really glad about that extension. That was a result of the advocacy of the financial aid community, the general public, all reaching out to our legislatures and asking for that extension so that we can at least graduate the students who have already received the Perkins loan. I could go on forever, so I'll kind of stop there and look forward to discussions.